In the last lesson, we looked at how the Nazis used terror and the police state to control the German people. Now, the Nazis were, as I alluded to in the last lesson, not just concerned with terrorizing the people into submission. They concerned themselves with bringing people into Nazi ideology, to ensuring that they follow them by attacking them at all, by attacking all their senses and getting them from all sorts of different angles. Now, the man put in charge of this was named Joseph Goebbels. We've met Goebbels before. He'd been a long confidant of Hitler and always been in charge of propaganda and election campaigns for the party since the middle of the 1920s. But when Hitler comes to power, he assumes his most prominent role to date as the Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment, which I find is quite a creepy title, because it implies that they were going to be enlightening Germany about all of the things they didn't understand it to this point. Anyhow, a little bit about Goebbels. Anyways, he passionately believed that Hitler was the savior of Germany, and his job was to persuade the German people of the benefits of Nazi rule. He tried to ensure that everything seen or heard was consistent with Nazi policies and ideals. Now, Goebbels, who was supported in his work by the SS and the Gestapo, wanted to close down just about anything that could publish or print or produce anti-Nazi messages. That is, newspapers, writers who were against the Nazis were arrested and thrown in concentration camps. And he ensured that the only available media that people could consume was at least consistent with the Nazi message. His, I guess, remit is quite broad, and he did a number of different things, all of which we'll go over in this lesson, but probably the most poignant and well-known, mostly because they've been captured in movies and because the Nuremberg stage still exists in Nuremberg, Germany, where the Nazis had their mass rallies, was the fact that he did organize these huge, massive rallies and marches, torchlit processions and meetings. The Nazi calendar is literally filled with special anniversaries. Goebbels changes the holidays to celebrate Hitler's birthday, the day of the founding of the Nazi Party, a day to celebrate the war heroes from the First World War, and so on. The best example of Nazi rally propaganda was the annual Nuremberg rally, which took place in the middle of each summer. These rallies brought color and excitement into people's lives. It really gave them a sense that they belonged to a great and powerful movement. The rallies also showed the German people the power of the state and convinced many that every other German supported the Nazis. Remember, too, that the Nazis came after the time of the Weimar Republic, a very chaotic period. And the rallies also gave a sense that this new government, this new administration of Germany was far from chaotic. They were orderly, okay? They had a message that was simple, that resonated with thousands, if not millions of Germans. And this was now, in a sense, a replacement for the Weimar years. So the rallies had a very poignant and special message. Lastly, they also reinforce a personality cult of Hitler, an idea called the cult of the Fuhrer, the cult of the leader. And they say, you know, they have all of these people orderly marching to the tune and listening to Hitler's speeches. Really sends a message that Hitler is in complete control and has power over Germany and the people in it. And this is meant to encourage loyalty and support for the Nazi regime. Here's a couple pictures and examples. You see the sense of everybody in long rows, very orderly, very huge spectacles, if you will. This is, of course, Hitler would come from the back, leading a procession through the orderly lines, everyone with their arm outstretched, chanting Sieg Heil, as Hitler walks up towards the stage to give one of his famous and many speeches about Germany, etc., where it's going, breaking the Treaty of Versailles, the Jews, what have you, and on and on and on. You know the type of things he talks about. Now, apart from rallies, Goebbels focused on many other things. We'll go sort of through them in this lesson in order. Art and architecture was something that they sought to transform. Goebbels disapproved of the artistic output of the Weimar Republic. He considered it degenerate. He considered the nature of the culture they created degenerate, something that was against the ideals of the Nazi state. So art galleries during the Nazi era were actually forced to remove expressionist paintings, sculptures which the Nazis didn't like, and replace them with sculptures which they did like, those that emphasized the heroic qualities of the Aryan race. Those that emphasize the Volk and the country people. An example of a Nazi-type painting is these Volkish girls going through the countryside in traditional German dress, happy and pleased with sort of their new life in Nazi Germany. This is the type of art they like. So art was then essentially a form of propaganda. They also favored public architecture. The architecture was mostly done in the classical style. Remember, the Nazis wanted a throwback to the way things used to be, the traditional classical style. They rallied against the Bauhaus movement and some of the art and architecture of the Weimar Republic, which was very modernist. Okay, the Nazis went back to stone-built buildings. They emphasized the authority of the state with these grand buildings and monuments that serve very little public utility purpose other than to show that the state who built them is all powerful. Music. The classical music in the Nazi era of Wagner, Beethoven, Bruckner is favored. Jewish composers like Mendelssohn and Mahler are effectively blacklisted. You're not allowed to listen to them. Military-style music was considered very acceptable, and records were published of military marches and military songs. Popular music, like folk song, was encouraged to a degree, but only folk songs that glorified the Nazi regime. What was not encouraged was probably the biggest music movement of the time, that is of jazz music. Jazz music becomes hugely popular in the 1930s in America, and it was banned in Nazi Germany because it had originated amongst the black community of the southern United States, particularly around the city of New Orleans. And jazz, as you can tell from this propaganda poster, was associated with the degenerate races such as the black people, and this is not something the Nazis considered the Aryan would listen to. And you see the black man here. This is a very racial portrayal of the black man, and he's also coincidentally wearing a Star of David. So music was something that the Nazis monitored as well. Literature. Books obviously were censored. Books are probably the biggest way that people spend their leisure time at this particular time. This is way long before TV. Books are censored. Libraries and bookshops had to remove the output of Jewish and communist authors. Very famously, in May 1933, Goebbels authorizes and supports a public book burning, which students in Berlin burned 20,000 un-German or Jewish books. Books that were popular in the Weimar Republic, such as All Quiet on the Western Front, which we've talked about, were burned also as well. Books about the achievements of war heroes, the achievements of Adolf Hitler, including Mein Kampf, and books that emphasized the importance of the family were encouraged instead and replaced the books that were in fact removed from libraries or burned. Film and theater. Film is a relatively new medium. It comes to prominence in the 1920s. We've talked about the importance of Weimar films, such as Metropolis. Well, Goebbels takes charge of the entire German film industry, and he realized that German people wanted affordable entertainment at affordable prices. So they produced a huge output of films and plays. Some of these were based on historical themes that people could obviously draw parallels with Hitler. So, they said that films and plays that emphasized that Hitler was a continuity of the great German war leaders of history, like Frederick the Great and Frederick Barbarossa, et cetera, et cetera. These type of films were very much encouraged. Also, there were a lot of films that were love stories and adventure exploits, all of which emphasize sort of the traditional union of man and woman, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in the end, the German always won in any sort of spy movie or adventure movie. Propaganda films were also created en masse. Propaganda films such as The Eternal Jew, the poster of which is on the right-hand side, were meant to show the degeneracy of the Jewish race to people. In fact, The Eternal Jew was so horrible that a lot of people actually left the theater because they were so scared by the portrayal of the Jewish people in this particular movie. Other ones and other movies attacked the British as brutal imperialists or celebrated the wonders of the Nazi regime. One of the best examples that did that is Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will, which glorified Hitler and actually was about the creation of and the portrayal of Hitler in the Nuremberg rallies of 1936. And this actually won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film of all things. Now, one more thing about the theater, because people went and they were locked effectively in the box that is the theater, they were also a captive audience. And they wouldn't allow people to trickle in after the movie had started. Everybody who was going to watch that movie had to be seated before the film began, because every film began with an official newsreel, which basically was a propaganda newsreel that portrayed the Nazi message. Unsurprisingly, newspapers and radio were also censored. Newspapers and magazines were all brought under Nazi control. It made it illegal, of course, very early on for anti-Nazi newspapers to even exist. Editors also had to attend daily press briefings where in Berlin they were told exactly what they would be printing that day. The Nazis made accessible cheap radios called the People's Receiver, where they could broadcast Hitler's message in pro-Nazi radio. In fact, on these receivers, you were unable to receive any channels that the Nazis didn't like. And of course, they ban all radio stations that you don't like within Germany, but other countries would broadcast into Germany, and these radios made it impossible to listen to foreign radio. In fact, radios were installed everywhere and loudspeakers placed in every corner so that everyone could hear Hitler's important announcements and speeches, so that essentially the message was always disseminated via audio to all German people. Now, in fact, as we learned last lesson, it's important to remember that listening to foreign radio was in fact an offense punishable by death in Nazi Germany. What's more, the Nazis concentrated on sport. It's not uncommon, and we understand it today. If you've ever watched the World Cup or the Euro or the Olympics, we see that there's a sense of national identity attached to our sporting exploits. And in Germany, in the 1930s, this was very much no different. The 1936 Berlin Olympics are really the apex of this, and I've attached with this article some very good articles I think you should read and find very interesting. The Berlin Olympics, presented by Goebbels, were a perfect opportunity to advertise the achievements of the Nazi state, not only within Germany, but abroad. The technical facilities and the money spent in the Berlin Olympics in 1936 were unparalleled. They built a stadium which still exists. It has 100,000 seats. It's equipped with television cameras and a photoelectronic timing device so that the actual, races are timed perfectly. And for the first time ever, a giant mounted stopwatch that everyone could see really brought the spectator experience down to home. Germany really saw the Berlin Olympics as a time to showcase to the world the greatness of the Nazi Germans. Now, Germany also tops the medal list. Hitler had actually hoped that this would be the case, and he can prove through the Olympics the dominance of the Aryan race. But interestingly enough, and very famously, in defiance of Hitler's theories on race, the most popular event, the Saturday night spectacle, the 100-meter dash, is won by a black American sprinter named Jesse Owens. He becomes actually the star athlete of the Games. He wins 4 gold medals, and he breaks 11 Olympic records in the process. Owens becomes one of the most famous athletes in the world. Now, very interestingly, and this is an aside, not relevant to what I'm going to talk about, if you ever get the chance to study civil rights in the United States and the sort of the difference between black and white, I find that the story of Jesse Owens very sad. Jesse Owens goes and he becomes an international celebrity. He defies Hitler. Hitler has to shake his hand, actually, when presenting him with the medal. It's an embarrassment for the Fuhrer. But when he returns back to the United States, he's just yet another black man, a man who's inferior because of his race in the United States. In fact, Jesse Owens is unable to get a job. He works as a janitor after the Olympics. And I mean, if you think about it today, it's the equivalent of Usain Bolt going back to his country and becoming a janitor. Now, Usain Bolt's famous. He sells shoes. He's a multi-millionaire. He's everywhere. One of the most popular and beloved athletes in the world. Owens in 36 could have been that way, but he returns back to America in the 1930s. In fact, Owens is so poor that he has to race horses for money in state fairs to make ends meet. It's a terribly, horribly embarrassing thing. Here you have a human being racing a horse for people's enjoyment as a consequence of racial prejudice in the United States. Interesting story, worth looking at. Do read the articles I posted with this of the Berlin Olympics. It's a fascinating thing. And lastly, really the trump card that gets to be played is Goebbels' job as propaganda minister is made much more easy because he is promoting a person who is an incredible public speaker. He was aware that Hitler and the spoken word were probably the most effective means of communication. And the Nazis had a huge advantage in this. Hitler was an extraordinary speaker, probably one of the greatest public speakers of all time. And Goebbels' quote here to the right really drives home the impact of Hitler's message. He says that he speaks his heart and therefore reaches the hearts of those who hear him. He has an amazing gift of sensing what is in the air. He has the ability to express things so clearly, logically, and directly that listeners are convinced that this is what they have always thought themselves. That is true. That is the true secret of the effectiveness of Adolf Hitler's speeches. Joseph Goebbels. Anyways, now we see that propaganda and mass media was also a way that Hitler was able to control the people. Now, as we go through all of these different lessons, you're going to have to figure out for yourself which was the most important. We'll go on to control of the church, minorities, and opposition next lesson.